Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished her rounds at St. Mary's Hospital in San Diego. The night shift was always challenging, but tonight felt different. The emergency department buzzed with unusual activity, and she could sense something big was coming. At 34, Sarah had been a nurse for 12 years. Her colleagues knew her as quiet, efficient, and mysteriously skilled in trauma situations. She never talked much about her past, always deflecting personal questions with a gentle smile and a change of subject. Most people assumed she had simply dedicated her life to nursing after losing someone close to her. Sarah's small frame and soft-spoken manner made her appear fragile, almost delicate. Patients often mistook her kindness for weakness until they saw her in action. When medical emergencies struck, something inside her changed completely. Her movements became precise, calculated, and lightning fast. Her voice carried authority that made even senior doctors listen without question. The hospital sat just 15 miles from the Naval Special Warfare Command base, which meant they regularly treated military personnel. Sarah had specifically requested to work here when she moved to San Diego 5 years ago, though she never explained why to her supervisors. Around midnight, the emergency sirens began wailing outside. Sarah looked up from her paperwork as the automatic doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in, their faces grim with determination. "Multiple casualties incoming," shouted the lead paramedic. Training exercise went wrong at the base. 12 men down, various injuries. ETA 2 minutes. The emergency department transformed instantly. Doctors appeared from every corner, nurses prepared trauma bays, and equipment rolled out with military precision. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, not from anxiety, but from the familiar rush of adrenaline she had learned to control years ago. The first ambulance arrived with sirens screaming. Paramedics wheeled in a young sailor. His leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Sarah immediately assessed the situation and began directing the medical team with calm efficiency. "Possible femur fracture with arterial involvement," she announced, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to stabilize the bleeding before we move him to surgery." Dr. Peterson, the attending physician, nodded approvingly. He had worked with Sarah for 3 years and had learned to trust her judgment implicitly. Her ability to read trauma situations was unlike anything he had ever seen. The second patient arrived unconscious with severe head trauma. Sarah quickly moved to assess his condition, her hands moving with practiced precision as she checked his pupils and vital signs. "Possible intracranial bleeding," she said quietly to Dr. Peterson. "His left pupil is fixed and dilated. We need a CT scan immediately." More ambulances kept arriving. Soon the emergency department held 12 injured military personnel, their conditions ranging from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries. The medical staff worked frantically, but Sarah seemed to be everywhere at once. She moved between patients with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural. When one soldier went into cardiac arrest, she was there with the defibrillator before anyone else realized what was happening. When another patient's airway became compromised, her hands were already reaching for the intubation equipment. "How does she do it?" whispered a young resident to his colleague. "It's like she knows what's going to happen before it happens." Sarah overheard the comment but said nothing. She had learned long ago that explaining her abilities only raised more questions she couldn't answer. Instead, she focused on the task at hand: saving lives. The most critically injured patient was a young petty officer named Rodriguez. He had suffered massive blood loss from a severed artery in his arm, and his blood pressure was dropping dangerously. The trauma surgeon was tied up with another patient, and time was running out. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed a surgical kit and began working on Rodriguez herself. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she located the damaged artery and applied pressure to stop the bleeding. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Dr. Peterson called out, concerned. "You're not qualified to perform surgery. He'll die if we wait," she replied calmly, never taking her eyes off her work. "I can stabilize him until Dr. Williams is available." She worked quickly and efficiently, using techniques that seemed far beyond what any nurse should know. Within minutes, She had successfully repaired the damaged artery and restored blood flow to Rodriguez's arm. His color began returning to normal, and his vital signs stabilized. Dr. Peterson watched in amazement. "Where did you learn to do that?" Sarah cleaned her hands methodically before answering. "Sometimes you pick things up along the way." As the night progressed, all 12 patients were stabilized and moved to appropriate departments for continued care. What should have been a catastrophic event with multiple casualties had turned into a textbook example of emergency medical response. The hospital staff celebrated their success, but Sarah quietly slipped away to complete her paperwork. She was finishing her notes when she heard heavy footsteps approaching the nurse's station. Looking up, she saw a tall man in military dress uniform walking toward her. He was clearly a high-ranking officer, his chest decorated with ribbons and insignia that marked him as someone very important. Commander Jake Morrison had arrived at the hospital to check on his men. At 42, he was a decorated Navy SEAL with 20 years of service. His unit had been conducting a routine training exercise when equipment failure led to the accident that injured 12 of his personnel. Morrison prided himself on knowing every detail about situations involving his men. He had spent the last 2 hours coordinating with base command and ensuring that the injured sailors received the best possible care. Now he wanted to personally thank the medical team that had saved their lives. As he approached the nurse's station, he was asking Dr. Peterson about the evening's events when he noticed a woman in scrubs organizing charts nearby. Something about her posture, the way she held her shoulders, seemed familiar. "The real hero tonight was Nurse Martinez, Dr. Peterson was saying. "I've never seen anything like it. She seemed to know exactly what each patient needed before we even finished our assessments. And she performed a vascular repair that would challenge most surgeons." Morrison glanced over at the nurse Dr. Peterson was praising. She had her back turned, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. There was something about the way she moved, something that triggered a memory from deep in his past. "Nurse Martinez?" Morrison asked, his voice suddenly tight. Sarah's hand froze over the chart she was filing. She recognized that voice instantly. It was a voice from another life. A life she had left behind 5 years ago. Slowly, she turned around. Commander Jake Morrison stood 15 feet away, his face pale with shock. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For a moment, the busy emergency department seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them staring at each other across an impossible distance of time and secrets. "Hello, Jake," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison took a step backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the wall to steady himself. The woman standing before him was supposed to be dead. He had attended her memorial service 5 years ago. He had watched them lower an empty casket into the ground while taps played in the background. "Ghost," he whispered, using the code name she had carried during their time together in classified operations. "You're supposed to be dead." Dr. Peterson looked between them, confused by the sudden tension in the air. Other staff members began to notice the strange interaction between the nurse and the military officer. Sarah felt the weight of every choice she had made over the past 5 years pressing down on her shoulders. She had built a new life, created a new identity, and found peace in helping people heal instead of other things. But seeing Jake Morrison standing there brought everything flooding back. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "But not here." Morrison nodded slowly, still processing the impossibility of the situation. The woman who had been declared killed in action 5 years ago was standing in front of him wearing hospital scrubs and a name tag that read, Sarah Martinez. The woman who had saved 12 of his men tonight was the same person who had once been the most lethal operative in their classified unit. Sarah looked around the emergency department, at the life she had carefully built over the past 5 years. Her colleagues were watching the strange interaction with growing curiosity. She knew that everything was about to change. "My shift ends in an hour," she said quietly. "There's a coffee shop 3 blocks north on 5th Street. It's open all night." Morrison nodded again, his military training helping him regain his composure. "I'll be there." As he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at her. "The 12 men you saved tonight. They have no idea who really saved their lives." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Good," she replied. That's how I want it. Morrison walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that her carefully constructed new life was about to collide with her buried past. She finished her paperwork mechanically, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. 1 hour later, she hung up her stethoscope, changed out of her scrubs, and walked into the night. The coffee shop Morrison had mentioned was a small, dimly lit place that stayed open for night shift workers from the hospital and nearby factories. Perfect for a conversation that should never happen. She pushed open the door and immediately spotted Morrison sitting in a corner booth, his back to the wall and his eyes on the entrance. Old habits never died. Even in civilian settings. Sarah walked over and slid into the seat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of 5 years of silence hung between them like a physical barrier. "I watched them bury you," Morrison finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I gave the eulogy at your memorial service." Sarah wrapped her hands around the coffee cup the waitress had automatically placed in front of her. "I know. I read about it later." "How?" The single word carried 5 years' worth of questions. Grief and betrayal. Sarah looked out the window at the empty street, gathering her thoughts. "It's a long story, Jake. And once I tell it, there's no going back for either of us." Morrison leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I've got all night. And after what I saw you do in that emergency room, I think I deserve some answers." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that the next few hours would either destroy the life she had built or somehow allow her two worlds to coexist. Either way, the time for secrets was over. The coffee shop's fluorescent lights hummed softly as Sarah stared into her cup, watching the steam rise and disappear. Morrison waited patiently, his military discipline keeping him silent while she gathered the courage to speak. The late-night quiet of the nearly empty diner felt surreal after the chaos of the emergency room. "My real name is Dr. Sarah Chen," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. 5 years ago, I was a Navy flight surgeon assigned to special operations, but that was just my cover." Morrison's eyes widened slightly. He had suspected she was more than just a nurse, but a doctor made more sense of what he had witnessed tonight. "I was recruited straight out of medical school," Sarah continued. "The Navy needed someone with advanced medical training who could also handle other responsibilities. Someone who could keep their people alive in situations where conventional medical support wasn't available." She paused, remembering the young woman she had been 10 years ago. Fresh from completing her surgical residency, full of idealism and a desire to serve her country, she had no idea what she was signing up for when the recruiters approached her. "They trained me at a facility that doesn't officially exist," she said, finally meeting Morrison's gaze. "Combat medicine, advanced trauma surgery, but also other skills. Weapons training, tactical operations, psychological warfare. They needed a doctor who could extract information from enemy prisoners and eliminate threats when necessary." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. He knew about those facilities, the black sites where the military trained their most specialized operatives. People who went into those programs often came out fundamentally changed. "The Ghost program," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. "You knew about it?" "Rumors. Stories that were denied whenever anyone asked directly. But some of us suspected that certain operations had support from assets that weren't on any official roster." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, buying herself time to organize the memories she had tried so hard to bury. "I spent 3 years moving between different units, different missions, always undercover as a flight surgeon or medical officer, but my real job was much more complicated." She remembered the first time she had been forced to interrogate a prisoner. The training had prepared her intellectually, but nothing could have prepared her emotionally for the moment when saving lives and taking lives became part of the same skill set. "That's when they assigned me to your unit," she said. "Task Force Phantom. You were a lieutenant commander then, leading classified operations in Southeast Asia." Morrison leaned back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "The medical officer who joined us in Thailand. Dr. Chen. You were so young, but you seemed to know things that weren't in any medical textbook." Sarah smiled sadly. I was 29, but I felt ancient. By then, I had been living a double life for 3 years. During the day, I was a doctor, saving lives. At night, I was something else entirely. She remembered those months with Task Force Phantom as both the best and worst time of her life. Morrison had been an exceptional leader, someone who genuinely cared about his people and understood the moral complexity of their missions. For the first time since joining the Ghost program, she had felt like part of a real team instead of a solitary operative moving between assignments. You were different from the other commanders I had worked with, she said. You asked questions about the ethics of our missions. You worried about the psychological impact on your people. Most military leaders just wanted results. Morrison remembered Dr. Chen well, now that he knew who she really was. She had been assigned to their unit for 6 months, officially to provide advanced medical support during their operations in the Golden Triangle. But he had noticed things that hadn't made sense at the time. You always knew too much about our targets, he said, information that wasn't in the intelligence briefings. And sometimes, you would disappear for hours during our downtime. Sarah nodded. I was running parallel missions. While you and your team were focused on disrupting drug trafficking operations, I was extracting intelligence from captured operatives and eliminating high-value targets that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The weight of those memories pressed down on her. She had killed 17 people during her time with Task Force Phantom, always quietly, always without leaving evidence. Morrison and his team never knew that the mysterious deaths of several key cartel leaders were the result of their mild-mannered medical officers' nighttime activities. There was one mission, she continued, her voice growing quieter. A joint operation to take down a weapons trafficking network that was selling American military hardware to terrorist organizations. Intelligence indicated that the network's leader was planning something big, possibly an attack on American soil. Morrison remembered that mission clearly. It had been their most dangerous operation, deep in enemy territory, with minimal backup support. 3 of his men had been wounded in the initial assault, and Dr. Chen had worked miracles keeping them alive under fire. You saved Rodriguez that night too, Morrison said, suddenly making the connection. Different Rodriguez, but the same impossible surgery under impossible conditions. Sarah smiled grimly. Some skills never leave you, no matter how hard you try to forget them, but that mission went wrong in ways that weren't in any official report. She remembered the moment when everything changed. They had successfully captured the weapons dealer, but during the interrogation, she discovered something that wasn't supposed to exist. Evidence of American officials involved in the trafficking network, selling weapons to fund operations that Congress had specifically defunded. The target we captured wasn't just a criminal, she said. He was working for people in our own government. The weapons trafficking was a funding mechanism for black operations that had been officially discontinued. Morrison felt his stomach drop. He had suspected that their mission had political implications beyond what they were told. But the idea of American officials being directly involved in arms trafficking was staggering. I found documented proof, Sarah continued. Financial records, communication logs, names and dates. Enough evidence to bring down a dozen high-ranking officials in the Pentagon and CIA. She had spent hours in the captured facility, copying files and photographing documents, while Morrison's team secured the perimeter. At the time, she thought she was gathering intelligence that would be used to expand their mission and capture more criminals. But when I tried to report what I found, I was told to destroy the evidence and never mention it again, she said, anger creeping into her voice for the first time. My handler made it clear that some secrets were more important than justice. Morrison understood the impossible position she had been placed in. Military personnel were trained to follow orders, but they were also sworn to protect American citizens from enemies both foreign and domestic. When those two loyalties conflicted, good people were forced to make terrible choices. You refused, he said. It wasn't a question, Sarah nodded. I made copies of everything before destroying the originals. I thought I could find a way to expose the truth without compromising ongoing operations. I was naive enough to believe that the system would eventually do the right thing. Instead, She had found herself under surveillance within weeks. Her communications were monitored, her movements tracked, and her access to classified information gradually restricted. It became clear that she was seen as a security risk, rather than a conscientious officer trying to prevent corruption. "They offered me a choice," she said. "Accept a promotion and transfer to a desk job, where I could be watched constantly, or have an unfortunate accident during my next mission." Morrison's hands clenched involuntarily. He had heard rumors of operatives who disappeared when they became inconvenient, but he had never imagined it could happen to someone under his command. "That's when you died," he said. Sarah nodded. "The official story was that I was killed during a reconnaissance mission in Myanmar. Helicopter crash. No survivors. Bodies never recovered due to hostile territory. Very convenient for everyone involved." In reality, she had spent months planning her escape with the help of a few allies who believed her story about the corruption she had discovered. People who understood that sometimes the only way to serve your country was to disappear from it entirely. "I had help," she said. "Other people in the intelligence community who were asking the same questions about funding and oversight. They created a new identity for me, complete with medical credentials and a work history that would stand up to routine background checks." The transformation from Dr. Sarah Chen, Navy flight surgeon and covert operative, to Sarah Martinez, civilian trauma nurse, had taken 2 years of careful planning and considerable resources. New fingerprints, altered dental records, and extensive plastic surgery to change her facial features just enough to avoid recognition. "Why nursing?" Morrison asked. "You were a surgeon. You could have done anything." Sarah considered the question carefully. "I needed to help people without drawing attention to myself. Nursing let me use my medical skills while staying in the background. And trauma nursing, it felt like penance for the things I had done." She had genuinely found peace in her new life, the satisfaction of saving lives without having to take them, the simple human connections with patients and colleagues, the ability to sleep at night without wondering who might be coming for her. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a good life. "For 5 years, it worked perfectly," she said. "I was just another nurse in a big hospital. No one suspected that I had ever been anything else." Morrison studied her face, noting the subtle changes that surgery had made. She was still recognizable to someone who had known her well, but different enough that casual acquaintances from her past would likely never make the connection. "But tonight changed everything," he said. Sarah nodded. "When I saw your men coming in, when I realized they were from the SEAL base, I knew there was a risk. But I couldn't just stand by and watch them die because I was afraid of being recognized." Odio. She had made a choice in that emergency room, prioritizing the lives of injured sailors over her own security. It was a choice that revealed everything about who she still was, beneath the carefully constructed identity of Sarah Martinez. "The Rodriguez surgery was the giveaway," she said. "That's not something a regular nurse could do, even with extensive trauma experience. I knew that anyone with medical training would start asking questions." Morrison remembered watching her work on his injured sailor. The precision of her movements, the advanced techniques she employed, the calm confidence under extreme pressure. It had been impressive for a nurse, but it made perfect sense for a former special operations surgeon. "Those 12 men are alive because of skills I learned in programs that don't officially exist," Sarah said. "Skills that I've spent 5 years trying to forget." Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. "But you haven't forgotten them. Tonight proved that. You're still the same person who saved my men in Thailand, just wearing different scrubs." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time in years. "I tried so hard to leave that person behind, Jake. I wanted to be normal, to help people without all the moral complexity and life and death decisions. But seeing those injured sailors, I couldn't pretend to be anything other than what I am." Morrison reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "What you are is a doctor who saves lives. Everything else is just details." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, remembering the connection they had shared during those months in Southeast Asia. Morrison had been the first person in years who had treated her as a complete human being instead of just a useful asset. "What happens now?" she asked. "You know who I am. You know I'm supposed to be dead." That knowledge puts you at risk. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. The people who wanted you dead 5 years ago. Are they still out there? Sarah nodded grimly. Some of them. The corruption I uncovered led to several congressional investigations, but most of the key players simply moved to different positions. They're still protecting their secrets, and I'm still a threat to those secrets. Morrison understood the gravity of the situation. By recognizing her, by sitting in this coffee shop, having this conversation, he was making himself complicit in her survival. If the wrong people learned about this meeting, both of their lives would be in danger. We need to figure out how to protect you, he said finally. And we need to decide what to do with the information you're carrying. Sarah squeezed his hand gratefully. After 5 years of isolation, of carrying her secrets alone, having someone who understood felt like a lifeline. There's more, she said. The evidence I gathered in Myanmar. I still have copies. Hidden away, but still accessible. I've been waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity to ensure it sees the light of day safely. Morrison's eyes widened. After all this time, you still have proof of the corruption? Sarah nodded. I've been adding to it over the years, following the money trails, documenting connections, building a case that would be impossible to ignore or cover up. But I needed to stay alive long enough to find the right way to release it. Morrison realized that the woman sitting across from him wasn't just a former operative trying to live a quiet life. She was still fighting the same battle, just from the shadows instead of the battlefield. Tonight might have been the opportunity you were waiting for, he said slowly. Saving my men. Proving yourself to be exactly the kind of person the American people deserve to know about. It changes the narrative. Sarah looked at him with growing hope. What do you mean? Morrison smiled for the first time since recognizing her in the hospital. I mean, it's time for Dr. Sarah Chen to come back from the dead. But this time, she's going to have backup. 3 weeks after their coffee shop meeting, Sarah found herself sitting in a secure conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command. The room was filled with people she had never expected to see again. Military investigators, Congressional Oversight Committee members, and journalists from major news organizations. Commander Morrison sat beside her, his presence both reassuring and terrifying. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering allies and building a strategy that would protect her while exposing the truth she had carried for 5 years. The decision to reveal her identity hadn't been easy. Sarah had spent days weighing the risks against the potential benefits, knowing that once she stepped forward, there would be no going back to her quiet life as a trauma nurse. The evidence speaks for itself, said Congresswoman Rebecca Torres, the chairwoman of the House Intelligence Committee. She had been one of the first people Morrison contacted, someone known for her integrity and her willingness to pursue difficult truths, regardless of political consequences. Spread across the conference table were dozens of documents, financial records, and communication logs that Sarah had accumulated over the years. The evidence painted a clear picture of a corruption network that had operated at the highest levels of government for over a decade. What I don't understand, said FBI Director James Patterson, is how you managed to stay hidden for 5 years while continuing to gather this intelligence. Sarah glanced at Morrison before answering. When you're declared dead, people stop looking for you. It gave me the freedom to observe and document without being detected. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of secret meetings and careful revelations. Morrison had used his connections in the military and intelligence communities to identify people who could be trusted with Sarah's story. Slowly, they had built a coalition of officials who were committed to seeing justice done. The 12 sailors you saved at St. Mary's Hospital, said Captain Williams, Morrison's commanding officer. They've all made full recoveries. They want to thank you personally, Sarah smiled. They don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job. But you weren't just doing your job, interjected Dr. Patricia Kim, the Navy's Surgeon General. The surgical techniques you used, the advanced trauma protocols you implemented, that level of expertise saved lives that would have been lost with conventional treatment. Dr. Kim had been instrumental in verifying Sarah's medical credentials and explaining how her unique training had enabled her to perform procedures that went far beyond normal nursing practice. Her testimony would be crucial in establishing Sarah's credibility and expertise. Morrison cleared his throat. If I may, I'd like to read a statement from Petty Officer Rodriguez, one of the sailors Dr. Chen saved that night. He pulled out a letter and began reading. I was dying when Nurse Martinez started working on me. I could feel my life slipping away. But her hands were steady and sure. She never hesitated, never showed fear, just focused on keeping me alive. I found out later that she's actually a doctor, a surgeon with training I can't even imagine. But that night, she was just someone who refused to let me die. My wife and children will get to see me come home because of her courage and skill. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had saved dozens of lives during her years as a nurse, but knowing that her secret skills had made the difference for Morrison's sailors felt different somehow. There's something else, Morrison said, his voice becoming more serious. We've been investigating the current whereabouts of the people who forced Dr. Chen to disappear 5 years ago. Some of them are still in positions of power. Assistant Director Sarah Park of the FBI leaned forward. We've identified at least 6 individuals who were directly involved in the weapons trafficking operation and subsequent cover-up. 3 are still active in government positions. 2 have moved to private defense contractors, and 1 is currently serving as a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Sarah felt a chill run through her. You mean they're still out there, still protecting their secrets, which is why we needed to move carefully, said Congresswoman Torres. If we had simply announced your survival and started making accusations, they would have found ways to discredit you, or worse. But now we have corroborating evidence, witness testimony, and institutional support. Over the past weeks, investigators had been quietly building cases against the individuals Sarah had identified. Financial forensics experts had traced money flows, communication analysts had decrypted old message traffic, and investigators had interviewed dozens of people who had worked in relevant positions during the time period in question. The beauty of your evidence, said FBI Director Patterson, is that it's not just accusations. You documented everything in real time, as it was happening. That kind of contemporaneous record is almost impossible to challenge. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who had risked their careers to support her decision to come forward. What happens to me now? I've been legally dead for 5 years. I have a new identity, a new life. How do we reconcile all of that? Admiral Thompson, the Navy's Judge Advocate General, answered her question. We've been working on that. Officially, Dr. Sarah Chen died in the line of duty 5 years ago. She'll receive a posthumous Navy Cross for her service and sacrifice. Sarah looked confused. I don't understand. Sarah Martinez, the trauma nurse who saved 12 sailors and exposed a major corruption scandal, will receive a Presidential Citizens Medal and full protection under the Federal Witness Protection Program, Admiral Thompson continued. 2 different people, 2 different lives, both deserving recognition. Morrison smiled at the elegant solution. It would allow Sarah to maintain her current identity while acknowledging her past service, and it would provide legal protection for her future. There's more, said Congresswoman Torres. We want you to testify before Congress about your experiences, not just about the corruption you uncovered, but about the broader issues of oversight and accountability in special operations. Sarah had expected this request, but it still made her nervous. Testifying means going public. Everyone will know who I am and what I did. Yes, Torres acknowledged. But it also means that your story becomes part of the official record. It becomes much harder for people to make you disappear when millions of Americans know your name and your service. Morrison reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. You don't have to decide right now. But I think you should know that the 12 sailors you saved have already gone public with their story. They've been telling reporters about the mysterious nurse who used advanced surgical techniques to save their lives. Sarah's eyes widened. They what? Captain Williams pulled out his phone and showed her a news article. Hero nurse uses military medical training to save 12 sailors. The story had been picked up by major news outlets across the country. The story doesn't identify you by name, Morrison explained, but it describes what happened that night in detail. People are already asking questions about who you are and where you learned your skills. Sarah realized that her anonymity was already compromised. The decision to come forward was no longer about whether to reveal her identity, but about how to control the narrative when her story inevitably became public. "If I testify," she said slowly, "I want to make sure it serves a purpose beyond just exposing the people who wronged me. I want it to prevent this from happening to other people." Congresswoman Torres nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what we hope to accomplish. Your testimony could lead to significant reforms in how special operations are conducted and overseen." Dr. Kim leaned forward. "There's also the medical angle. Your unique training and experience could revolutionize how we prepare medical personnel for special operations. The techniques you use to save those sailors could be taught to others." Sarah looked around the room one more time, seeing hope and determination in the faces of people who had committed themselves to seeing justice done. For the first time in 5 years, she felt like she wasn't carrying her burden alone. "All right," she said finally. "I'll testify. But I have conditions." Admiral Thompson pulled out a notepad. "Name them." "First, I want full immunity for anyone who helped me disappear and create my new identity. They were protecting me from people who wanted me dead, and they shouldn't face consequences for that." "Granted," said FBI Director Patterson without hesitation. "Second, I want to continue working as a trauma nurse. I don't want to go back to special operations or intelligence work. I've found my calling in civilian medicine." Dr. Kim smiled. "We were hoping you'd say that. We'd like to offer you a position developing trauma protocols for military medical personnel. You could teach others while continuing your clinical work. And third," Sarah said, looking directly at Morrison, "I want protection for Commander Morrison and his unit. They had nothing to do with the corruption I uncovered, and they shouldn't face retaliation for supporting me." Morrison felt a warmth spread through his chest at her concern for his welfare. Even after everything she had been through, her first instinct was still to protect the people around her. "Also granted," said Admiral Thompson. "In fact, Commander Morrison's handling of this situation demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership and integrity the Navy values. His career will not be negatively affected." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a weight she had carried for 5 years, finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. "Then let's do this." 2 months later, Sarah sat at a witness table in front of the House Intelligence Committee, facing a room full of cameras and reporters. She wore a simple blue dress and the small gold pin that identified her as a recipient of the Presidential Citizens Medal. Her testimony lasted 6 hours and covered everything from her initial recruitment into the Ghost program to her decision to save Morrison's sailors despite the risk of exposure. She spoke clearly and calmly, presenting the evidence she had gathered with the same precision she used when treating trauma patients. The impact was immediate and profound. Within days of her testimony, 3 high-ranking officials resigned their positions. Congressional investigations were launched into multiple departments, and reform legislation was introduced to increase oversight of special operations funding. But perhaps more importantly, Sarah's story inspired others to come forward. Former operatives who had witnessed corruption or abuse began contacting congressional investigators, knowing that they wouldn't face retaliation alone. 6 months after her testimony, Sarah was back at St. Mary's Hospital. But now she worked in a new capacity. She spent half her time as a trauma nurse and half her time training military medical personnel in advanced combat medicine techniques. Morrison visited regularly, both professionally as part of his duties overseeing medical training for special operations personnel, and personally as someone who had become an important part of her life again. "Any regrets?" he asked one evening, as they walked along the beach near the hospital. Sarah considered the question carefully. "About coming forward? No. About the years I spent hiding? Sometimes, but I needed that time to figure out who I was when I wasn't being directed by mission parameters and classified objectives." Morrison understood. "And who are you now?" Sarah smiled, looking out at the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. "I'm someone who saves lives. Sometimes with a scalpel, sometimes with a syringe, sometimes with testimony before Congress, but always someone who puts healing before everything else." They walked in comfortable silence for a while. 2 people who had found their way back to each other and to a sense of purpose that transcended their individual experiences. "The 12 sailors you saved that night," Morrison said eventually. "They still ask about you. They want to know when you're coming to visit the base." Sarah laughed. "They don't need to keep thanking me. They would have done the same thing in my position." "Maybe," Morrison said. "But they didn't have to make the choice you made. They didn't have to risk everything they had built to save people they didn't know." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. "Yes, they would have. That's what good people do, Jake. They help when they can, regardless of the personal cost." Morrison looked at the woman who had been declared dead, who had built a new life from nothing, who had risked everything to save his sailors and expose the truth. She was right about good people. And she was living proof that sometimes the most ordinary-looking heroes are the ones with the most extraordinary stories to tell. A year later, the Sarah Martinez Trauma Training Center opened at Naval Medical Center San Diego. It was named for the nurse who had saved 12 sailors and changed the way the military thought about medical training and ethical leadership. Sarah continued working there, teaching combat medicine to military personnel while maintaining her practice as a civilian trauma nurse. She had found a way to honor both parts of her identity: the special operations surgeon who had served in secret, and the nurse who had chosen healing over hiding. And sometimes, late at night when the hospital was quiet, she would remember that moment when Commander Morrison walked into the emergency room and her two worlds collided. It had been terrifying at the time, but it had also been the beginning of something better than she had ever imagined possible. She looked like an ordinary nurse, but she had saved 12 men, exposed major corruption, and proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let people die when you have the skills to save them.